Are scientists compromised? Find out on this episode of Pushback.
Go, 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 Jonny, go, go. Go, Jonny, go, go. Go, Jonny, go, go.
If you're concerned about the direction our culture is heading, then maybe it's time to push back.
Hello everyone, it's Dr. Jonny here, and this is another episode of Pushback. I don't have a lot of time for preliminary conversation because I have a lot of ground to cover because this is such an important topic. I want to set the stage again and just refresh your memory of what we're dealing with here. We're talking about how culture impacts our day-to-day life and especially our children's lives. I want to focus on that this year because I feel like it's common ground. We all care about our children. We all want our children to thrive and to do well and to live a life of purpose and destiny. Every parent would want that for their kids. And yet we realize that what we do and the way we behave and the worldview that we carry has extreme consequences for our children. And in fact, I believe that so many of the decisions that are being made today are actually killing our kids. And it's from that premise that I've been going through really talking just to parents over this first quarter of the year, because I believe parents have the greatest, or should or ought to have the greatest influence in our children's lives. And so if we address parents, I believe that we can address 80 to 90% of the problems in our society, and everything that we talk about needs to be heard, recognized, appreciated, and moved on by parents with an incredible amount of intentionality, because what our children are facing today is unprecedented. And I've switched now into this quarter of the year talking about what I call pseudoscience. Scientists have an incredible amount of influence in our society. Always has. Historically, those with scientific and technology minds have shaped so much of our culture, and rightfully so. I am a scientist, and I'm very proud of that. I carry a medical degree. It's an important degree. I can confidently say that I've saved people's lives through what I've learned and through my training, and that means a lot to me. And so I care very much about what's happening even in the scientific community in our culture. What do I mean by that? Well, I talked before about that I really believe there are battle lines being drawn, and there's an unholy alliance that has taken place in the culture in the realm of politics and what I call an ungodly religion. I mentioned it over the last couple podcasts that I've talked about evolution. I needed to start there because it's really the premise of an ungodly religion that is infiltrated, definitely our public school system, definitely our colleges, and the scientific world has unfortunately bowed a knee to this ideology and worldview. And that has consequences. And I believe in all my heart that the scientific community has become compromised. And it needs to be talked about. Because if I'm bold enough to sit here in the front of this microphone on my Pushback podcast and say that I believe that science is bowing a knee to a cultish, godless religion, I think that should get our attention. That is what I'm saying, is that this is beyond science, this is beyond reason, this is beyond rationality. This has gone into a cultish type ideology and worldview, and the word religion is correct, because religion is about our origins and our purposes of life. And that's exactly what this is about. And so if science is being compromised, this has huge impact on our culture, and we just need to be aware. We need to have our eyes open, parents. We need to have our eyes open, students and children, to what the truth is. And not only just the truth, but the ability to discern. I believe the Lord gives us the ability to discern truth from falsehoods, from fabrications, from people being compromised with their own ideologies and viewpoints. Now, you can say that about my podcast. Am I compromised by what I believe? Probably true, yes. But from a scientific standpoint, I am able to be rational. And even in my profession, I can pray for people. I can deliver hope. I can change atmospheres by what I believe. But I also am administering an evidence-based profession to people who come see me in the emergency department. That's what I do. And I'm not apologizing for that or backing down from that. It's part of my training. It's a part of what I've learned. I don't believe it's an either or. I believe it's a both and. That we can live in the realm of the kingdom, at the same token, be here on earth and learn and study his truth and his goodness. And I believe that science is exactly that. And I believe science and the scientific method, where we observe and we learn and we report facts without other evidences or biases or political ideologies moving into what we've studied and what we've learned. And unfortunately, we saw this certainly during the COVID pandemic. I'm not going to go into that, but we saw a lot of compromise there. Obviously, in my realm in medicine, and I'm going to go into that in greater detail over the next couple weeks, how we have been literally killing our kids, even in my own profession. The worldview that is starting to now infiltrate and leak into the medical world is staggering and quite sobering. I can talk and we'll talk about climate change and the compromise of scientists in that realm. And of course, we can go into transgender issues, and I'll touch on all of these. But today, I want to talk very specifically about the scientists themselves and scientific journalism. What's being reported to you? What information is being conveyed to you? And is that information compromised? I read an unbelievably good, effective article written by James B. Meigs. It was released in their spring 2024 article entitled Unscientific American. This is such a great article. If you want even greater details, quite a long article, but I just want to pull the salient points out of this article. He is talking very specifically about the magazine and publishing of what's called Scientific American. It's been around for hundreds of years and has always been sort of the forefront of rational scientific information. He writes, in continuous publication since 1845, Scientific American is the country's leading mainstream science magazine. Authors published in its pages have included Albert Einstein, Francis Crick, Jonas Salk, and J. Robert Oppenheimer. Some 200 Nobel Prize winners in all. Incredible. An incredible history to this publication. He writes, in the 21st century, however, American scientific media, including Scientific American, began to slip into lockstep with progressive beliefs. Suddenly, certain orthodoxies, especially concerning race, gender, or climate, couldn't be questioned. American journalism has never been very good at covering science. In fact, the mainstream press is generally a cheap date when it comes to stories about alternative medicine, UFO sightings, pop psychology, or various forms of junk science. For many years, that was one factor that made Scientific America's rigorous reporting so vital. The New York Times, National Geographic, Smithsonian, and a few other mainstream publications also produced top-notch science coverage. Peer-reviewed academic journals aimed at specialists met higher standards still. But over the past decade or so, the quality of science journalism, even at the top publications, has declined in a new and alarming way. Today's journalistic failings don't owe simply to lazy reporting or a weakness for sensationalism, but to a sweeping and increasingly pervasive, wait for it, drum roll, worldview. See, people are starting to see what I've been seeing in this battlefield. This is a battle of worldview, and that's why it's so critically important. I love this next sentence that he writes. He says, it is hard to put a single name on this sprawling ideology. Well, I feel like I can. And I believe it's a godless religion. I believe it's a cultish, godless religion. That's the name that I would put on this sprawling ideology. Let's call it what it is. I'm tired of dancing around and tap dancing around these issues. This is what this is. Yes, we follow a God-fearing religion. We follow him. And so these are competing views. Let's just call it what it is. He says it has its roots both in radical 1960s critiques of capitalism and in the late 20th century postmodern movement that sought to problemize notions of objective truth. Interesting word. Critical race theory, which sees structural racism as the grand organizing principle of our society, is one branch. Queer studies, which seeks to deconstruct traditional norms of family, sex, and gender, is another. Critics of this worldview sometimes call it identity politics. Supporters prefer the term intersectionality. So here we go. We're establishing battlefields, battle lines. What are we willing to fight for? What mountains are we willing to die on? And I believe this is one of those. This is the whole purpose and reason of this podcast, is we have to see what we are against so that we know what we're fighting against, that we're not just swinging at the air. There's a real world view coming up against us and what we believe, and these traditional values that are so important to us that have proven scientifically over time that creates healthier family environments. And as family goes, so goes the culture. He goes on to write, the DEI worldview took over our institutions slowly, then all at once. Many on the left, especially journalists, saw Donald Trump's election in 2016 as an existential threat to the necessitated dropping the guardrails of balance and objectivity. Then in early 2020, COVID lockdowns put Americans under unbearable pressure. And finally, in May of 2020, George Floyd's death under the knee of a Minneapolis police officer provided the spark. Protesters exploded onto the streets. Every institution from coffee houses to Fortune 500 companies felt compelled to demonstrate its commitment to the new anti-racist ethos. In an already polarized environment, most media outlets lunged further left. The old Scientific American that I subscribed to in college was all about the science, University of New Mexico evolutionary psychologist Jeffrey Miller told me. It was factual reporting on new ideas and findings from physics to psychology with a clear writing style, excellent illustration, and no obvious political agenda. Miller says that he noticed a gradual change about 15 years ago and then a woke political bias that got more flagrant and irrational. Over recent years, the leading U.S. science journals, Nature and Science, and the UK-based New Scientist made a similar pivot, he says. By the time Trump was elected in 2016, he says, the Scientific American editors seem to have decided that fighting conservatives was more important than reporting on science. And so the unholy alliance has begun. It's clear. And I'm finding more and more evidence that shows that I'm right about this. This is becoming more clear. Battle lines are being drawn. Scientific American's increasing engagement in politics drew national attention in late 2020 when the magazine, for the first time in its 175-year history, endorsed a presidential candidate. Quote, the evidence and the science show that Donald Trump has badly damaged the U.S. and its people, the editors wrote. That is why we urge you to vote for Joe Biden. That's pretty blunt. Scientific American wasn't alone in endorsing a presidential candidate in 2020. Nature also endorsed Biden in that election. The New England Journal of Medicine, this hits close to home, indirectly did the same, writing that, quote, our current leaders have demonstrated that they are dangerously incompetent and should not, quote, keep their jobs, end quote. Vinay Prasad, the prominent oncologist and public health expert, recently lampooned the endorsement trend on his Substack, asking whether science journals will tell him who to vote for again in 2024. Here's an idea, call it crazy, he wrote. Why don't scientists focus on science and let politics decide the election? When scientists insert themselves into politics, he added, and this is critical, the only result is we are forfeiting our credibility. In other words, they're compromised. They're compromised. They are no longer scientists. They are now pseudoscientists. They're promoting a form of science that's actually not science. He goes on to write, but what does it mean to focus on science? Many of us learn the standard model of scientific method in high school. We understand that science attempts, not always perfectly, to shield the search for truth from political interference, religious dogmas, or personal emotions and biases. But that model of science has been under attack for half a century. Today's woke activists challenge the legitimacy of science on various grounds. The predominance of white males in its history, the racist attitudes held by some of its pioneers, its inferior to indigenous ways of knowing, and so on. Ironically, as Christopher Rufo points out in his book America's Cultural Revolution, this postmodern ideology, which began as a critique of oppressive power structures, today empowers the most illiberal, repressive voices within academic and other institutions. It's doing the opposite of what they've called for, and we see it everywhere on the news. America's Cultural Revolution, this is what we're talking about here, my friends. They believe the new style of scientific journalism is being defined by this postmodern worldview, the idea that all facts are relative or culturally determined. What? All facts are relative or culturally determined? Of course, if scientific facts are just products of a particular cultural milieu, he says, then everything is a narrative that has to reflect some political side. Without an agreed-upon framework to separate valid from invalid claims, without science, in other words, people fall back on their hunches and in-group biases. This is fortifying what I've been saying, my friends. This is key as we're looking at the understanding of an unholy alliance between politics and pseudoscience. Traditionally, science reporting was mostly descriptive. Writers strove to explain new discoveries in a particular field. The new style of science journalism takes the form of advocacy. Writers seek to nudge readers towards a politically approved opinion. So scientists and journalists aren't known for being shrinking violets. What makes them tolerate this enforced conformity? The intimidation described above is one factor. Academia and journalism are both notoriously insecure fields. A single accusation of racism or anti-trans bias can be a career ender. In many organizations, this gives the youngest, most radical members of the community disproportionate power to set ideological agendas. It's so well written. It's so right on the money. Scientists, science publishers, and science journalists simply haven't learned how to say no to emotionally unhinged activists. They're prone to emotional blackmail, and they tend to be very naive about the political goals of activists who claim that scientific finding X or Y will impose harm on some groups. And I intend to talk about that very specifically as I go forward over the next couple of weeks of this podcast, is the battle between the perceived harm and actual harm. We see it in every field, including my own. Whether motivated by good intentions, conformity, or fear of ostracization, scientific censorship undermines both the scientific process and public trust. The authors of the Pro-Social Motives paper point to at least one obvious cost of scientific censorship: the suppression of accurate information. When scientists claim to represent a consensus about ideas that remain in dispute or avoid certain topics entirely, those decisions filter down through the journalistic food chain. Findings that support the social justice worldview get amplified in the media, while disapproved topics are excoriated as disinformation. Not only do scientists lose the opportunity to form a clearer picture of the world, the public does too. At the same time, the public notices when claims made by health officials and other experts prove to be based more on politics than on science. A new Pew Research poll finds that percentage of Americans who say that they have a great deal of trust in scientists have fallen from 39% in 2020 to 23% today. It has gone from essentially 40% to 23% in 4 years. What's happening? It's because people are realizing that this isn't science at all. How can they have a great deal of trust in something that isn't science at all? it's pseudoscience. Unfortunately, progressive activists today begin with their preferred policy outcomes or ideological conclusions, and then try to force scientists and journalists to fall in line. So what is their ideological conclusion? There is no God. That's the ultimate worldview. That's at the top of the food chain. There is no God. Start there. And then anything that doesn't line up with that gets pushed aside, fired, put in the trash. Pink slip. And everything that does gets highlighted. Their worldview insists, rather than changing the progressive orthodoxy, science must serve as its handmaiden. This pre-Enlightenment style of thinking used to hold sway only in radical political subcultures and arcane corners of academia. Today it is reflected even in our leading institutions and science publications. Without a return to the core principles of science and the broader tradition of fact-based discourse and debate, our society risks drifting onto the rocks of irrationality. Could there be a clearer picture of the debate that we are having in this world over our culture? Some of it has easily crossed over into the world of irrationality, and we shake our head and say, why are we even talking about this? And why is science not backing up the truth? It can, and it should, and it needs to. See, my friends, at the end of the day, scientists are human beings, just like me, with biases, with sin, with selfish motives, and a compromised worldview that by definition has left them compromised. They've actually disconnected from their scientific purposes here on this earth and left them compromised. It's not science. They have become pseudoscientists and should be viewed that way until they can prove that they are not. And I love the word prove because that's at the heart of science. And I always have to be careful when I get into the realm of science too, because we believe even if we don't see. We have a faith and we have a belief in God, even if we don't always see it with our own eyes. But I believe fully and truly that science backs up his word in every way, and that science is simply a discovery of the magnificence of who he is. And it's not an either or there either. It's a both and. That we can love science and love the discovery and the creativity of what he has made and still have a blind childlike faith in who he is. It can be both. And what a privilege to watch it unfold even in my own life as I sit in the chair in medical school and my eyes are wide open to the gloriousness and majesty of what he's created even just in our own human bodies. But see, scientists, if they don't adhere to that, and if they're disconnected, and if they start with a worldview that there is no God, then they are going to be disconnected and they are going to be compromised in actually what they research, study, write, and release. But Psalm 119, 1-6 says, "Joyful are people of integrity who follow the instructions of the Lord. Joyful are those who obey his laws and search for him with all their hearts." I love the word search. It just feels like there's that scientific discovery behind that word. And it says, "They do not compromise with evil, and they walk only in his paths. You have charged us to keep your commandments carefully. Oh, that my actions would consistently reflect your decrees, that I will not be ashamed when I compare my life with your commands." That's called integrity. I will not be compromised, not in what I believe about him, not what I see even in my workplace and what I learn about the human body and medicine. I want to be a true scientist, a true believer. I believe I can be both. And I believe it's essential for our culture because scientists bring an incredible amount of influence. And I believe that these pseudoscientists are killing our children. I believe there's been a shift. We've seen it just in the last 10 years. There's been a shift in even what we believe about science in the last 4 years. And this is dangerous. There's an unholy alliance that has come up against us, but it is not too late. When we rise up as strong, healthy families, when we connect with a strong, healthy church, I believe that we can be a demonstration to the earth of what is true, what is right, what is full of integrity, so that we can look at our lives and not be ashamed. That we will not compromise with evil, and that we would be people of integrity. With that being said, let's go together now to set and shape the culture.